What scientific breakthrough are we closer to than most people realize? Story 1. Pancreatic cancer, the mRNA vaccine that is actually working. Pancreatic cancer is one of the most lethal diagnoses in medicine. The 5-year survival rate sits at approximately 13%, and that figure has barely moved in decades despite enormous investment in treatment research. The disease is difficult to detect early, difficult to treat surgically, resistant to conventional chemotherapy, and by the time most patients receive a diagnosis, the cancer has already spread beyond the point where curative treatment is possible. It has been, for the purposes of vaccine development, one of the most discouraging targets in oncology, which makes the results of the early phase clinical trial published in February 2025 genuinely significant. The study, investigating an investigational mRNA vaccine directed against pancreatic cancer antigens, found that the vaccine induced sustained immune activity in a small patient group over a follow-up period long enough to be meaningful. The immune response, the production of T cells specifically targeting the cancer, persisted at detectable levels well beyond the vaccination period. This is the key finding. Previous cancer vaccine attempts have often produced initial immune responses that fail to sustain. Sustained immune activation is the mechanism that matters. The mRNA platform is the same technology that enabled the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines, and that has since been applied across a range of oncological targets. Its advantage is speed and specificity. The vaccine can be designed to target antigens specific to an individual patient's tumor, making it a personalized treatment rather than a one-size-fits-all intervention. For pancreatic cancer, where tumor heterogeneity has historically defeated broad-spectrum approaches, this personalization may be the critical factor. The trial is early phase. The patient group is small. The path from sustained immune activity to demonstrated survival benefit is long and not guaranteed. But for a cancer that has resisted every therapeutic approach for decades, a sustained immune response in an early trial is not nothing. It is the closest thing to hope that pancreatic cancer patients have seen in a very long time. Story 2. Huntington's disease, the treatment that arrived a generation early. Huntington's disease is caused by a single genetic mutation, an abnormal repetition of a CAG sequence in the HIT gene that produces a misfolded protein that progressively destroys neurons in the brain, particularly in the striatum and cortex. It is inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern, meaning a single copy of the mutated gene is sufficient to cause the disease, and a child of an affected parent has a 50% chance of inheriting it. Until recently, a positive genetic test for Huntington's was effectively a death sentence with a delay. There were no treatments capable of slowing the progression. Only symptomatic management of the movement disorders, psychiatric symptoms, and cognitive decline that characterize the disease's later stages. The psychological calculus of Huntington's genetic testing is among the most difficult in medicine. Knowing you carry the gene means knowing your future with a specificity that no other disease allows. Many at-risk individuals choose not to be tested precisely because the knowledge, in the absence of treatment, produces anxiety without benefit. The reasonable expectation was that genetic therapies might eventually arrive in time for the next generation, for children and grandchildren of today's at-risk population. What researchers have actually developed is a viral gene therapy that delivers genetic material directly into the nervous system, targeting the abnormal CAG repeats that produce the toxic protein. The genetically altered virus acts as a vector, carrying a therapeutic sequence that silences or corrects the mutant Huntington gene at the molecular level, rather than simply managing its downstream effects. Clinical trials are advancing. FDA approval is anticipated within the current regulatory cycle. The person who expected this treatment to be available to their children, not themselves, is experiencing the particular vertigo of a future arriving early. That vertigo, the recalibration of a life lived in the shadow of a specific disease, suddenly illuminated by the possibility of escape, is one of the most human moments that medical progress produces. Story 3. Growing new teeth. The end of dentistry as we know it. Humans are diffiodonts. we grow two sets of teeth, the deciduous set of childhood and the permanent set of adulthood. And when the permanent teeth are damaged, decayed, or lost, the body produces no replacement. Dental implants, bridges, and dentures are prosthetic solutions to a biological limitation that has been assumed to be fundamental. Crocodiles grow new teeth throughout their lives. Sharks replace teeth continuously. The biological mechanism for tooth regeneration exists in nature. The question has always been whether it could be activated in humans. Research groups in Japan, China, and the United Kingdom have been pursuing this question with increasing urgency. The Japanese research team at Kyoto University, which has received the most attention, has identified a protein called USAG1 that suppresses tooth growth. In animal models, inhibiting USAG1 with a monoclonal antibody produced tooth regrowth in mice with congenital tooth deficiency, animals that normally grow fewer teeth than usual due to genetic factors. Subsequent work has extended this finding to ferrets, which share more dental characteristics with humans than mice do. The pathway from animal model to human clinical trial is not short, but in this case it is being pursued with significant institutional backing. A clinical trial in human patients is anticipated within 6 years, with therapeutic use potentially following within the decade if the trials proceed as expected. The target population initially is patients with congenital tooth deficiency, a condition affecting approximately 1% of the population, but the implications extend to anyone with tooth loss from any cause. The implications for dentistry are significant. A pharmaceutical intervention that stimulates natural tooth regrowth from the dental pulp and supporting tissues would represent a biological solution where the field has relied on prosthetics for the entirety of its history. The business model of dentistry depends substantially on the permanence of tooth loss. That permanence may not be permanent. Story 4. The measles vaccine's hidden superpower is about to change medicine. The measles vaccine prevents measles. This is its stated purpose and its documented achievement. Measles cases have declined by more than 99% in vaccinated populations compared to pre-vaccine baseline rates, and the vaccine is considered one of the most effective public health interventions in history. But researchers studying population-level mortality data have consistently found something that the measles prevention framing doesn't fully account for. Children who receive the measles vaccine appear to have lower mortality from a range of infectious diseases beyond measles itself, at rates that exceed what preventing measles alone would explain. The mechanism is immune memory training. Measles, the disease, causes a phenomenon called immune amnesia. It destroys a significant fraction of the immune cells that carry memory of previous infections, effectively resetting the immune system and leaving survivors vulnerable to diseases they had previously been protected against. The measles vaccine, by preventing this immune amnesia, preserves the accumulated immune memory that children build through their early years. The result is not just measles prevention, but the preservation of a broad immune competence that affects susceptibility to a range of pathogens. The further implication, still being developed in the research literature, is that measles vaccination may have beneficial effects on immune function beyond simply preventing immune amnesia. Some research suggests that the live attenuated virus in the vaccine produces non-specific immune training that improves the immune system's responsiveness to other threats. This would place the measles vaccine in a category of interventions that have broad immunological benefits not captured by their specific disease target. The practical implication is that measles vaccination programs in regions where measles is still endemic are doing more work than the measles prevention framing suggests, and the immunological principles underlying this finding are generating research into other live vaccines with potential for similar non-specific protective effects. A vaccine that prevents one disease but trains the immune system against many is a more powerful tool than anyone initially recognized. Story 5. A kidney disease vaccine for cats, and what it means for human medicine. Chronic kidney disease is the leading cause of death in domestic cats, affecting an estimated 30–40% of cats over the age of 10 and a higher proportion of cats over 15. The disease is progressive, poorly reversible once established, and has been managed with dietary modification, fluid therapy, and phosphorus binders that slow progression without addressing the underlying pathology. For cat owners, it is the disease they will most likely watch their pet die from, and the trajectory is sufficiently prolonged to be genuinely distressing. The vaccine under development targets a protein called feline kidney disease protein, identified through research into the immunological mechanisms of feline chronic kidney disease. The approach is preventive rather than therapeutic, designed to be administered to young cats before kidney disease develops, stimulating an immune response that protects against the pathological processes that cause the kidney damage accumulating over years of a cat's life. Preliminary results from trials have suggested significant protective effects, with treated animals showing substantially lower rates of kidney disease progression and, most remarkably, potential lifespan extensions to 30 years or beyond in some projections. The research matters beyond cats for two reasons. First, the kidney disease mechanisms in cats share significant biological parallels with chronic kidney disease in humans, meaning the immunological approach may translate. Human chronic kidney disease affects approximately 10% of the global population and is a leading cause of cardiovascular disease, dialysis dependency, and premature death. A vaccine preventive approach to human kidney disease, if the underlying mechanisms are sufficiently similar, would be transformative. Second, successful development of a veterinary vaccine for a chronic degenerative disease, as opposed to an infectious disease, would establish the proof of concept that immune intervention can prevent non-infectious organ damage. That proof of concept has implications across the spectrum of chronic disease that extends well beyond kidney function. Story 6: Artificial wombs, ectogenesis, and the end of biological necessity. The development of a functional artificial womb, a technology capable of supporting fetal development from conception or early pregnancy to term outside a human body, has been advancing in animal models for longer than the general public is aware. In 2017, researchers at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia successfully developed extremely premature lamb fetuses in a fluid-filled bag system they called a biobag, maintaining the animals in a fetal-like environment connected to an external oxygenation system in place of a placenta. The lambs developed normally over the 4-week period of the study, emerging healthy and without apparent developmental deficits. The gap between the lamb biobag demonstration and a clinical system suitable for human use involves regulatory, technical, and ethical dimensions that are not trivial. The physiological differences between lamb and human fetal development, the immune compatibility challenges of an external system, and the ethical framework surrounding fetal status at various stages of development all require resolution before clinical application is possible. Researchers estimate a realistic timeline of 10 to 20 years for a system capable of supporting extremely premature human infants from the current clinical threshold of viability at approximately 22-24 weeks gestation. The longer-term vision, ectogenesis, the development of a fetus from conception to term entirely outside the body, is further away and raises more complex questions. The implications for reproductive autonomy, the definition of personhood, the relationship between biological motherhood and social parenthood, and the potential uses and misuses of the technology by state and corporate actors are questions that bioethicists are already grappling with. What is not distant is the application to premature birth. Every week of gestation below 37 weeks carries measurable risks that a superior artificial support environment could reduce. The technology being developed for the most premature infants is the foundation on which everything else will eventually be built. Story 7: Practical fusion. Why the people in the room are no longer joking about timelines. The fusion energy joke has run for 70 years. Practical fusion power is always 20 years away, and has been for the entire history of the field. The joke is funny because it has been consistently true. Every generation of fusion researchers has believed they were close, and every generation has been wrong about the timeline while being right about the physics. The energy release from hydrogen fusion is real and enormous. The engineering challenge of containing plasma at temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees Celsius long enough and densely enough to produce net energy gain has simply proved harder than anyone expected. Something has changed in the last several years that people attending fusion conferences have noticed before the general public has. The entry of private capital into the fusion sector has brought an engineering culture that differs from the academic research culture that dominated the field for decades. Companies like Commonwealth Fusion Systems, Tay Technologies, Helion Energy, and several others are applying a startup methodology, rapid iteration, tight timelines, commercial milestones, to problems that government research programs addressed on multi-decade bureaucratic schedules. Commonwealth Fusion's Spark tokamak, which uses high-temperature superconducting magnets that produce field strengths previously unachievable, is scheduled for first plasma in the mid-2020s and has attracted investment from serious institutional sources. The National Ignition Facility's December 2022 demonstration of fusion ignition, more energy out of the fusion reaction than laser energy deposited into the fuel, was a genuine scientific milestone, even though it fell far short of the energy break even required for a practical power plant. NIF has since repeated the achievement and improved on it. The people in the room, researchers with decades of experience who have heard and discounted optimistic timelines before, are no longer being purely dismissive. That shift in affect among the skeptics may be the most meaningful signal available. Story 8. Superconductivity. 35 years of almost, and why this time might be different. Superconductivity is the property of certain materials to conduct electricity with exactly zero electrical resistance below a critical temperature. A conventional conductor, copper wire for example, loses some energy to resistance with every meter of transmission, which is why power grids require constant energy input, and why electric motors and generators are significantly less efficient than their theoretical maximum. A superconducting power grid would lose nothing to resistance. Superconducting motors and generators would approach theoretical efficiency. Superconducting magnets, which already exist in MRI machines and particle accelerators, would become cheap enough for widespread industrial and transportation applications. The problem is the critical temperature. Conventional superconductors require cooling to near absolute zero, making them impractical for most applications. High-temperature superconductors, discovered in the 1980s, operate at somewhat higher temperatures but still require liquid nitrogen cooling at minimum. The goal of room-temperature superconductivity, a material that conducts without resistance at ambient conditions, has been pursued for the entire history of the field and has produced a series of promising claims that have not survived reproducibility testing. The most recent cluster of promising results involves hydrogen-rich compounds under extreme pressure, hydrides that have demonstrated superconducting properties at temperatures approaching room temperature, but only under pressures equivalent to the Earth's lower mantle, making practical application extremely challenging. The research direction is, however, producing materials with higher and higher critical temperatures, suggesting that the theoretical ceiling is higher than previously thought. The advance that would change everything is a material that superconducts at room temperature and atmospheric pressure. Every credible researcher in the field believes this is possible. The question of when has defeated prediction for 4 decades. The pace of materials discovery, accelerated by machine learning models trained to predict material properties before synthesis, has increased sufficiently that the next significant advance may arrive sooner than the historical pattern suggests. Story 9. Life on another planet. The James Webb Telescope is already looking. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched on Christmas Day 2021 and fully operational since mid-2022, is the most powerful observatory ever deployed. Its primary mirror, gold-coated and spanning 5 meters, collects light at infrared wavelengths that reveal the composition of exoplanet atmospheres through a technique called transmission spectroscopy. When a planet passes in front of its host star, the starlight that filters through the planet's atmosphere carries the spectral signatures of the molecules present: water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and potentially biosignature gases like oxygen, ozone, or dimethyl sulfide that are difficult to produce through geological processes alone. The telescope is already collecting this data. Observations of the TRAPPIST-1 system, 7 Earth-sized planets orbiting a red dwarf star 39 light-years away, 3 of which are in the habitable zone, are ongoing. Early results have ruled out thick hydrogen-dominated atmospheres on several of the planets, which is consistent with rocky terrestrial planets rather than mini-Neptunes. Whether any of the TRAPPIST-1 planets retain thin, Earth-like atmospheres is a question that Webb's current observational program is designed to answer. The detection of a biosignature gas in an exoplanet atmosphere would not be definitive proof of life. Each potential biosignature has potential abiotic sources that would need to be ruled out. But the combination of multiple biosignature gases in a planetary atmosphere would be extremely difficult to explain without biology. The statistical probability of multiple independent abiotic processes simultaneously producing several biosignature gases in the correct ratios is low enough that such a detection would shift scientific consensus. The timeline is realistic within the current decade. Webb has a minimum design lifetime of 10 years, with fuel reserves potentially extending operations beyond 20. The nearby exoplanet targets are already in the observing queue. The detection, if it comes, will arrive as a spectral analysis before it arrives as a photograph. It will be a graph. It will change everything. Story 10. Self-replicating autonomous robots. The exponential curve nobody is ready for. The logic of self-replication is straightforward, and its implications are not. A system capable of producing a functional copy of itself from available materials can, given sufficient raw material and energy, produce 2 copies, then 4, then 8, in an exponential growth curve whose early stages appear slow and whose later stages are catastrophically fast. Biological systems have operated on this principle for 4 billion years. Technological systems have not yet achieved genuine self-replication, but the components required are assembling. Advanced 3D printing systems can already produce many of their own structural components from polymer feedstock. CNC machining centers can produce metal parts with the precision required for mechanical systems. Robotic arms can perform assembly operations. The gap between these existing capabilities and a genuinely self-replicating robotic system is not in any single technology, but in the integration, the development of a system that can assess its own condition, identify which components require replacement or reproduction, acquire the necessary materials, and complete the manufacturing and assembly process without human intervention. The AI requirement is less demanding than it might appear. A self-replicating system does not need general intelligence. It needs sufficient task-specific competence to navigate a defined manufacturing environment and execute a defined sequence of operations reliably. Industrial robots already operate at this level of capability in constrained environments. The extension to a self-replicating system requires that the manufacturing environment include the robot itself as a product. The question of what self-replicating robots would do, whether their exponential growth would be controlled and beneficial or uncontrolled and catastrophic, is the question that the science fiction literature has explored for a century without resolution. The distinction between a future in which self-replicating machines build infrastructure, grow food, manufacture goods, and do dangerous work, and a future in which they consume available resources in uncontrolled replication depends entirely on the quality of the control systems and the intentions of whoever deploys them first. Story 11. Fusion energy, the 40-year joke that is running out of punchline. The physics of fusion energy has been understood since the 1950s. 2 hydrogen isotopes, deuterium and tritium, fuse under conditions of sufficient temperature and pressure to produce helium, a neutron, and an energy release approximately 4 million times greater per unit mass than the burning of coal. The fuel is effectively unlimited, deuterium is extracted from seawater at trivial cost, and tritium can be bred from lithium in the reactor itself. The waste product, helium, is inert. The process produces no carbon dioxide. If it can be made to work at scale, it solves both the energy and the climate problems simultaneously. The engineering challenge is containment. The plasma required for fusion reactions must be maintained at temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the core of the sun, in a configuration stable enough for the fusion reactions to produce more energy than the containment system consumes. No material can touch plasma at these temperatures, so magnetic fields, generated by superconducting electromagnets in the tokamak design, must do the containing. The physics of plasma is complex and turbulent in ways that have repeatedly confounded prediction. The French ITER project, an international collaboration representing 35 countries and the most expensive science experiment ever constructed, is designed to demonstrate a fusion plasma that produces 10 times the energy input. Its first plasma is expected in 2025. ITER is not a power plant. It is a scientific demonstration, and a commercial power plant based on its findings would require additional decades of engineering. The private sector is moving faster. Commonwealth Fusion Systems expects to demonstrate net energy gain from a compact tokamak using high-temperature superconducting magnets within years rather than decades. Helion Energy has a signed power purchase agreement with Microsoft for electricity by 2028. The 40-year joke is acquiring a punchline, and the punchline is that it was approximately 40 years accurate. Story 12. Economical geothermal, the clean energy source hiding under our feet. Geothermal energy, extracting heat from the Earth's interior, is not a new concept. Geothermal power plants have operated in Iceland, the Philippines, and parts of the western United States for decades, providing reliable baseload electricity without fuel costs or carbon emissions. The limitation has always been geographic. Conventional geothermal energy requires access to naturally occurring hydrothermal systems close to the surface, volcanic regions, tectonic boundaries, areas where naturally heated water or steam is accessible at drillable depths. Most of the world does not have this. Most of the world has heat-bearing rock at depth, but conventional geothermal technology cannot economically access it. Enhanced geothermal systems, also called engineered geothermal systems, are the technology that changes this constraint. The approach involves drilling deep wells into hot, dry rock, fracturing the rock to create a permeable network, pumping water down into the fractures, and recovering steam or hot water from a second well drilled into the same reservoir. The heat is the resource. The geology is engineering rather than a gift. The technique borrows extensively from the oil and gas industry, whose directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing technology can be adapted to geothermal applications. The economics have been challenging, primarily because drilling deep wells is expensive and the returns on geothermal investment are slow compared to natural gas plants. What has changed is drilling technology and drilling speed. Companies like Quaise Energy are developing millimeter wave energy beams, the same technology used in fusion research for plasma heating, to vaporize rock at depth, potentially reaching temperatures hot enough for supercritical geothermal extraction at costs competitive with other energy sources. The resource is, in principle, inexhaustible on any human timescale. The heat of the Earth's interior will not diminish meaningfully for billions of years. The energy available at accessible depth is sufficient to power global civilization many times over. The only question has always been economics, and the economics are changing. Story 13. Protein folding. AlphaFold cracked the code, and the world hasn't caught up yet. Proteins are the molecular machines of biology. They perform virtually every function in a living cell. They catalyze chemical reactions, provide structural support, carry signals, regulate gene expression, and defend against pathogens. A protein's function is determined entirely by its three-dimensional shape, which is in turn determined by the sequence of amino acids that constitute it. For 50 years, predicting the three-dimensional shape of a protein from its amino acid sequence, the protein folding problem, was considered one of the hardest problems in computational biology. In 2020, DeepMind's AlphaFold system achieved accuracy in protein structure prediction that matched or exceeded experimental methods, effectively solving the protein folding problem. In 2022, DeepMind released the AlphaFold protein structure database, containing predicted structures for over 200 million proteins across virtually all known organisms. This database is freely and publicly available to researchers worldwide. The implications are still propagating through biology and medicine. Understanding protein structure is foundational to med discovery. Pharmaceutical meds typically work by binding to specific proteins, and knowing the precise three-dimensional shape of a target protein allows med designers to engineer molecules that fit it with specificity. The traditional experimental methods for determining protein structure, X-ray crystallography, cryo-electron microscopy, are slow, expensive, and work for only a fraction of proteins. AlphaFold's predictions are fast, cheap, and broadly applicable. The gap between the availability of these structures and their translation into new meds is the research pipeline, validating that the predicted structures are functionally accurate, identifying which proteins are viable therapeutic targets, designing molecules that interact with them productively, and running the clinical trials required for approval. This pipeline takes years, but it is now running on a foundation of structural information that simply did not exist before 2020. The field is working from a map of the molecular landscape that is orders of magnitude more complete than anything that preceded it. Story 14. AI and Ancient Texts. We are about to know more about the ancient world than was ever imagined. The Herculaneum scrolls were buried under 6 meters of volcanic material when Vesuvius erupted in 79 C. They are the only surviving library from the ancient world. Approximately 1,800 carbonist scrolls recovered from the Villa of the Papyri, too fragile to unroll without disintegrating, their texts invisible to conventional imaging. In 2023, a team of researchers using AI trained on the subtle variations in ink density on high-resolution X-ray scans of the unopened scrolls began recovering readable text from papyri that had not been read in 2,000 years. By 2024, the first complete passages were being published, including previously unknown works of philosophy. This is one example of what is happening across the field of ancient text recovery. AI models trained on partially legible fragments of papyri, parchment, and inscriptions are reconstructing text with confidence intervals that independent classical scholars have verified against known passages, and are then applying the same interpolation to unknown passages with statistically similar confidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Oxyrhynchus papyri collection, the damaged manuscripts of the Byzantine era, the partially legible inscriptions of ancient temples, all of these are being processed at speeds and with accuracy levels that exceed what human scholars working with traditional methods can achieve. The volume of text about to enter circulation is, in the estimation of researchers working in this space, larger than anything that has been available since the ancient libraries existed. Works of Greek philosophy and science known only from references in other texts. Roman historical accounts of events whose primary sources were considered lost. Medical, mathematical, and astronomical texts from civilizations whose intellectual output had been assumed irretrievable. The popular conversation about AI is preoccupied with job displacement and chatbot ethics. In the margins of that conversation, the intellectual heritage of the ancient world is being recovered at a pace that would have been considered miraculous by every classical scholar who preceded this generation. Story 15. Narcolepsy, the actual cure that is coming, not just another treatment. Narcolepsy type 1 is caused by the destruction of hypothalamic neurons that produce hypocretin, also called orexin, a neuropeptide that plays a central role in maintaining wakefulness and regulating the sleep-wake cycle. The destruction is believed to be autoimmune in most cases, triggered by an environmental factor in genetically susceptible individuals. The result is a nervous system that cannot reliably maintain wakefulness, producing sudden transitions into sleep, fragmented nighttime sleep, cataplexy, sudden loss of muscle tone triggered by emotion, and hypnagogic hallucinations. Current treatments for narcolepsy address symptoms rather than causes. Stimulants and wakefulness, promoting agents, modafinil, amphetamine salts, sodium oxybate, reduce the frequency and severity of sleep attacks without doing anything about the underlying absence of hypocretin. Patients manage their condition for life on a pharmacological regime that controls but does not resolve the fundamental deficit. The breakthrough in development targets the orexin receptor directly. Orexin agonists, molecules that bind to and activate the orexin receptor, mimicking the effect of the missing hypocretin neuropeptide, would address the cause of the symptom rather than working around it. The brain's orexin system would be pharmacologically supplemented in a way that more closely resembles normal function than any existing treatment achieves. Multiple pharmaceutical companies have orexin receptor agonists in clinical trials. Early results have shown efficacy in maintaining wakefulness that exceeds existing treatments in direct comparison. The mechanism is specific enough to potentially avoid the side effects associated with broad-spectrum stimulants. The regulatory pathway is clear. The distinction between a treatment that manages a disease and a treatment that addresses its mechanism is not merely semantic. For patients who have structured their lives around the unpredictability of their condition, a therapy that restores reliable wakefulness by replacing the chemical their immune system destroyed is not an incremental improvement. It is the resolution of a problem they were told was permanent. Story 16. Polio eradication. Closer than the news makes it seem. Polio has been reduced from a disease that paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children annually to one that infected fewer than 700 people worldwide in 2021, a decline of more than 99.9% from the pre-vaccination peak. 2 of the 3 wild poliovirus serotypes have been certified as globally eradicated. Wild poliovirus type 2 was declared eradicated in 2015. Wild poliovirus type 3 in 2019. Wild poliovirus type 1 now circulates in only 2 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, where conflict, population displacement, and historical vaccine hesitancy have created persistent transmission chains in specific geographic areas. The completion of eradication, the elimination of wild poliovirus type 1 from its last 2 endemic countries, is a logistical and political challenge more than a scientific one. The vaccines work. The delivery system, administered through the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, has demonstrated in dozens of countries that complete cessation of transmission is achievable. The remaining challenge is achieving consistent vaccine coverage in areas where access is complicated by active conflict, and where some populations have been persuaded by misinformation that the vaccine program has ulterior motives. The additional complication is circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, a rare phenomenon in which the live attenuated virus in the oral polio vaccine, used because of its lower cost and easier administration in resource-limited settings, reverts toward virulence and causes outbreaks in under-vaccinated populations. Transitioning to the inactivated polio vaccine, which cannot produce vaccine-derived strains, is part of the endgame strategy. The infrastructure being built for polio eradication, the cold chains, the community health worker networks, the disease surveillance systems, has value beyond polio. When the last case is confirmed, the infrastructure will be available for other vaccine-preventable diseases. The eradication of smallpox in 1980 took 30 years from the introduction of the vaccine. Polio eradication, if it succeeds, will represent the completion of a project whose finish line is genuinely in sight. Story 17. Engineered enzymes, the molecular machines quietly transforming everything. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze chemical reactions. They dramatically accelerate reactions that would otherwise proceed too slowly to be useful, and they do so with extraordinary specificity, acting on particular molecules in particular configurations while leaving similar molecules untouched. Biological systems run on enzymes. Every metabolic process in every living cell is catalyzed by a specific enzyme. The specificity and efficiency of biological catalysis has historically exceeded what industrial chemistry can achieve with inorganic catalysts, which is why biotechnology has spent decades attempting to harness and engineer enzymes for industrial applications. The protein folding revolution, particularly the capabilities demonstrated by AlphaFold and subsequent systems, has transformed enzyme engineering from an empirical art into something approaching a rational design discipline. Instead of screening thousands of random enzyme variants for the desired catalytic properties, researchers can now model the structure of a designed enzyme, predict its catalytic activity from the structure, and synthesize only the variants most likely to work. The iteration cycle has compressed from months to days. The applications are spreading across industries. Engineered enzymes are replacing harsh chemical processes in pharmaceutical manufacturing, reducing the temperature, pressure, and toxic solvent requirements for reactions that were previously only achievable under extreme conditions. Enzymes are breaking down plastic waste, particularly PET, the material in water bottles, at commercially relevant rates, opening a biochemical recycling pathway that mechanical and chemical recycling cannot match for contaminated or mixed plastic streams. Enzymes are being used in laundry detergents to remove stains at lower temperatures, reducing energy consumption. They are being used in food processing, in textile manufacturing, in paper production. The broader implication is that chemistry, one of the most energy-intensive and waste-generating of industrial activities, is being partially replaced by biochemistry, which operates at room temperature and atmospheric pressure and produces water as its primary byproduct. This transition is underway. Most people have not noticed it yet. Story 18. Fusion plasma at 22 minutes. What the French tokamak actually achieved plasma confinement duration is one of the key metrics in fusion research, and it measures something different from what most science news coverage implies. Holding a plasma, an ionized gas, at temperatures exceeding those at the core of the sun for longer periods means demonstrating that the magnetic confinement system can maintain stable conditions for the duration that a practical power plant would require to operate continuously. A fusion power plant would not work in short pulses. It would need to maintain plasma for hours or continuously, extracting energy from the sustained fusion reactions. Every advance in confinement duration is an advance toward demonstrating that continuous operation is achievable. The Torre Supra tokamak at the ITER site in Cataraqui, France, achieved a world record plasma duration of 22 minutes in 2024, not 22 minutes of fusion energy production, which requires temperatures and densities beyond what Torre Supra achieves, but 22 minutes of stable plasma confinement. The previous record was held by the Korean Star Tokamak, which maintained high-temperature plasma for 30 seconds in 2021 and has since extended its records. The Chinese East Tokamak achieved plasma temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees Celsius for over 15 minutes in a 2023 experiment. These records sound incremental from outside the field, but they represent the progressive mastery of plasma physics that has confounded engineers for 7 decades. Each extension of plasma duration at the required temperatures provides data on the instabilities that limit confinement, enabling the engineering solutions that the next generation of machines can implement. ITER, the International Fusion Project, whose first plasma is expected in the mid-2020s, is designed to hold plasma at fusion-relevant conditions long enough to produce 10 times the energy input. It is the machine whose results will determine the timeline and design of the first commercial fusion power plants. The 22-minute plasma is not the end of the journey. It is a marker on the road that no longer looks quite as long as it did. Story 19. Alzheimer's disease. Tau tangles and the treatments that are finally targeting the right things. Alzheimer's disease research spent approximately 30 years pursuing the amyloid hypothesis, the proposition that the disease is caused by the accumulation of amyloid beta plaques in the brain, and that clearing these plaques would slow or stop the disease. The clinical trial record of amyloid targeting meds was one of the most discouraging in pharmaceutical history. Med after med successfully cleared amyloid from the brain of treated patients and failed to produce corresponding improvements in cognitive function. 2 meds, lecanemab and donanemab, have now received regulatory approval and demonstrated statistically significant slowing of cognitive decline. But the effect sizes are modest, and the meds are associated with brain swelling and bleeding in a significant fraction of patients. The tau hypothesis offers a different target. Tau is a protein that normally helps stabilize the internal skeleton of neurons. In Alzheimer's disease and related conditions, tau becomes abnormally phosphorylated, detaches from the neuronal skeleton, and forms the neurofibrillary tangles that are the other defining pathological feature of the disease. Unlike amyloid plaques, which may accumulate years before clinical symptoms appear, tau tangle distribution correlates more closely with the actual pattern of cognitive decline. Tau spreads through the brain in a pattern that tracks the progression of the disease. Several anti-tau therapies are in advanced clinical trials. These include monoclonal antibodies targeting phosphorylated tau, antisense oligonucleotides that reduce tau production at the genetic level, and small molecule inhibitors of the enzymes responsible for tau phosphorylation. The results so far are promising in early trials, though the fundamental challenge of all Alzheimer's therapeutics, that irreversible neuronal damage may have already occurred by the time clinical diagnosis is possible, applies equally to tau targeting approaches. The disease is not yet conquered, but the field is finally aiming at the right targets. Story 20. Semi-synthetic organisms, life with an expanded genetic alphabet. Life on Earth uses a genetic alphabet of 4 letters, 4 nucleotide bases, abbreviated A, T, C, and G, whose pairing rules define the structure of DNA and whose triplet combinations encode the amino acids of proteins. This 4-letter alphabet has been universal across all life for approximately 4 billion years. In 2014, researchers at the Scripps Research Institute created a bacterium that contained 2 additional synthetic nucleotide bases, X and Y, that could be replicated by the bacterium's own DNA replication machinery. The genetic alphabet of Earth life was extended from 4 letters to 6 for the first time in the history of biology. The organism containing the expanded genetic code was initially unable to translate its synthetic bases into proteins. It could replicate the expanded DNA, but not use it for protein synthesis. Subsequent work resolved this limitation. By 2019, the same research group had produced a semi-synthetic bacterium that could transcribe the synthetic bases into messenger RNA and translate that RNA into proteins containing unnatural amino acids not found in any natural organism. The genetic code that evolution has used for 4 billion years has been expanded by human engineering. The implications are extensive. Natural proteins are built from 20 standard amino acids. An expanded genetic code can direct the incorporation of non-standard amino acids with properties, chemical reactivity, spectroscopic characteristics, binding geometry that natural amino acids do not possess. This enables the synthesis of proteins with precisely engineered properties for pharmaceutical and industrial applications. The deeper implication is that the 4-letter genetic code is not the only possible biological information system, but simply the one that history selected. Engineering organisms that operate on different informational principles is a capability with boundaries that have not yet been approached. We are at the beginning of a biology that is not fully continuous with the biology that evolution produced. Story 21. Hair loss, the Japanese research that actually has a mechanism. Male pattern baldness, androgenetic alopecia, affects approximately 50% of men over 50. And a smaller but significant proportion of women. The condition is caused by the sensitivity of hair follicles in specific scalp regions to dihydrotestosterone, a metabolite of testosterone, which progressively miniaturizes the follicles until they cease producing visible hair. The follicles do not die, they remain present in the scalp in a dormant state, which is why treatments that block, date, or stimulate follicle activity can sometimes reverse miniaturization in the early stages of the condition. The research attracting most attention is from Riken Institute and Kyoto University in Japan, where teams have been working on the regeneration of hair follicles from stem cells. The approach involves taking cells from an existing follicle, culturing them to produce hair follicle organoids, three-dimensional structures that recapitulate the cellular architecture of a hair follicle, and implanting these organoids into the scalp where they can integrate with the existing tissue and produce new hair follicles. The challenge has been maintaining the complex cellular organization of the follicle organoid through the implantation process. Hair follicle development requires the coordinated interaction of multiple cell types: epithelial cells, dermal papilla cells, melanocytes, in precise spatial relationship. Early attempts produced follicle-like structures that were disorganized and produced abnormal or no hair. Refinements in the culture conditions and implantation technique have produced increasingly normal follicle structures in animal models. Human clinical trials are expected within several years. The commercial pressure behind this research is significant. Male pattern baldness affects hundreds of millions of people and represents a large addressable market that has been served exclusively by symptomatic treatments for the entirety of the field's history. The company that achieves reliable follicle regeneration will not lack for customers. Story 22. Quantum computing and fusion. The two breakthroughs arriving together. Quantum computing and fusion energy share a structural similarity that is worth noting. Both involve physics that is completely understood, engineering that has proved extraordinarily difficult, and progress that has been consistently slower than optimistic predictions suggested, but consistently faster than pessimistic ones. Both are now in a phase where the incremental advances of recent years have compounded into something that looks qualitatively different from the trajectory of the previous decade. Quantum computing has moved from a laboratory curiosity to a competitive commercial sector. Google, Microsoft, and a range of well-funded startups are producing quantum processors with increasing qubit counts and, more importantly, improving error rates. The critical metric is not the number of qubits, but the fidelity of quantum operations, how accurately the processor can execute a quantum gate without introducing errors. As error rates improve, the threshold for fault-tolerant quantum computation, the regime where error correction can be applied, and arbitrarily long calculations become possible, comes closer. Google's 2024 announcement of a quantum chip achieving below-threshold error rates in a specific experimental configuration was the most significant milestone in the field since the demonstration of quantum supremacy in 2019. The practical applications that become possible with fault-tolerant quantum computing, cryptography breaking, materials simulation for med discovery and battery design, optimization of logistics and financial systems are well understood. The timeline has been persistently uncertain. What is different now is that the companies are no longer making indefinite promises. They are publishing hardware roadmaps with specific technical milestones and delivering against them. Fusion and quantum computing together represent the two most consequential unsolved engineering problems of the 20th century being solved in the 21st. The coincidence of their convergence may not be entirely coincidental. Advances in plasma physics simulation, enabled by quantum computing, could accelerate the fusion program, while fusion-produced electricity could power the energy-intensive quantum computing facilities of the future. Story 23. Humanoid robots. The pieces are there, and someone is about to put them together. The components of a functional humanoid robot, the sensors, the actuators, the computing hardware, the battery technology, the machine learning systems, have been advancing on independent tracks for years. Boston Dynamics has demonstrated bipedal locomotion that handles uneven terrain, stairs, and dynamic perturbations with a robustness that would have been considered science fiction 15 years ago. Tesla's Optimus program has produced a walking robot capable of manipulating objects in a factory environment. Figure AI, 1X Technologies, and Agility Robotics have all demonstrated humanoid systems with expanding capability sets in the past 2 years. The bottleneck has not been any single technical capability, but the integration of all capabilities into a system reliable enough for deployment in unstructured environments. Environments not designed specifically for robots, which includes essentially everywhere outside a controlled factory floor. A humanoid robot that works in a factory designed around its limitations is a different category of product from one that can navigate an ordinary building, open arbitrary doors, handle objects it has not been specifically trained on, and interact with people whose behavior it cannot predict. The integration problem is being attacked with foundation models, large AI systems trained on diverse data that can generalize to novel situations rather than relying on task-specific programming. The same class of model that produces language fluency in chatbots, trained on sensor and motor data rather than text, shows early promise for producing motor generalization, the ability to handle novel objects and situations without task-specific training. The business case question, what would you use a humanoid robot for that you would pay for, is being answered empirically rather than theoretically. Warehouse logistics, last-mile delivery, hazardous environment inspection, elderly care assistance, construction. Each application develops as the hardware becomes capable enough to attempt it. The hardware is becoming capable enough faster than the business case conversation has caught up. Story 24. Self-driving cars. The technology worked and nobody is talking about it. The public conversation about autonomous vehicles has been shaped by two competing narratives. The optimistic Silicon Valley promise that self-driving cars were imminent, which dominated the mid-2010s and proved significantly premature, and the subsequent backlash when the promised timelines were not met, which installed a skepticism that has persisted even as the technology has actually matured. The result is that a technology that is now working reliably, commercially, at scale in specific markets, is being underreported relative to its actual significance. Waymo, the autonomous vehicle subsidiary of Alphabet, has been operating fully driverless commercial ride-hailing services in Phoenix since 2020 and expanded to San Francisco in 2023. The San Francisco deployment, in one of the most complex urban driving environments in the United States, characterized by dense traffic, unpredictable cyclists, jaywalking pedestrians, and infrastructure that challenges human drivers, has logged millions of miles without a human safety driver. The safety record has not been perfect, but the accident rate is comparable to human drivers in equivalent conditions, and certain categories of accidents, those caused by impaired driving, distracted driving, and driver fatigue, are structurally absent. The technology that a passenger experiences as an ordinary taxi ride, 20 minutes through downtown San Francisco traffic, without a driver, without incident, without anything to note, represents the resolution of a problem that was considered one of the hardest in robotics and AI for decades. The sensors, the perception systems, the prediction of other drivers and pedestrians' behavior, the real-time path planning, the handling of edge cases, all of these are working well enough to operate commercially in the real world. The scaling question, how quickly Waymo and its competitors can expand from proven markets to broader deployment, is the remaining challenge. The demonstration that it works is complete. Story 25. ALS, the decade that could finally end the cruelest disease in medicine, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, destroys the motor neurons that control voluntary movement, progressively eliminating the ability to walk, speak, swallow, and breathe. Most patients die within 2 to 5 years of diagnosis. The disease spares sensory function and typically leaves cognition intact, meaning patients experience the loss of their physical capacities with full awareness. It is the disease that shows you what you are losing while you lose it, without offering either rapid mercy or any realistic hope of reversal. The history of ALS treatment is one of the most discouraging in medicine. 2 meds, riluzole and edaravone, have been approved and demonstrated modest effects on survival and functional decline. Neither significantly changes the trajectory for most patients. The heterogeneity of the disease, with genetic and sporadic forms involving different mechanisms, has complicated the development of broadly effective therapies. What has changed is the genetic architecture. Approximately 10% of ALS cases have an identified genetic cause, And for these familial forms, gene therapy approaches targeting the causative genes have advanced into clinical trials. Antisense oligonucleotides targeting the SOD1 gene, which is mutated in approximately 2% of all cases, have demonstrated reduction of the SOD1 protein in cerebrospinal fluid, and in one trial showed evidence of survival benefit. The approach is being extended to other genetic forms of the disease. For the more common sporadic ALS, which does not have a single identified genetic cause, research into the shared disease mechanisms, the accumulation of toxic protein aggregates, the inflammatory response of support cells, the metabolic failure of motor neurons, is producing candidate therapeutics that are entering clinical trials. The decade ahead will not cure ALS across all its forms, but the probability that at least one group of ALS patients will have a genuinely effective treatment by the mid-2030s is higher than it has been at any point in the history of the disease. Story 26. Terraforming Venus. The CO2 problem as the solution. Venus is, by most measures, the least hospitable planet in the solar system. Its surface temperature of 465 degrees Celsius exceeds that of Mercury despite being twice as far from the Sun, because its dense carbon dioxide atmosphere creates a runaway greenhouse effect that traps incoming solar radiation with near-perfect efficiency. Its atmospheric pressure at the surface is 92 times Earth's, equivalent to being 900 meters underwater. Its clouds are composed of sulfuric acid. The prospect of terraforming Venus, making it habitable, has been considered one of the most theoretically challenging planetary engineering problems ever proposed. The CO2 atmosphere that makes Venus a hell is, in the terraforming analysis, simultaneously the most significant obstacle and the most significant resource. The proposal involves introducing photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria or engineered variants, into the upper Venusian atmosphere, where temperatures and pressures are comparable to Earth's surface, and allowing them to consume CO2 and produce oxygen. This is not as fast as it sounds. The Venusian atmosphere contains roughly 95% CO2 at a total mass many times greater than Earth's entire atmospheric mass, and photosynthetic drawdown of that CO2 would take a very long time. The faster approaches involve chemical or mechanical CO2 sequestration at scale, reactions with Venusian surface materials that mineralize the CO2 into stable carbonates, or industrial processes that extract carbon and deposit oxygen. None of these are near-term. None of these are achievable with current technology. But the analysis has shifted from impossible to possible on geological timescales with sufficiently advanced technology. The reason to think about this now is that the same CO2 management problems Venus presents in extreme form are the problems Earth faces in milder form. The engineering approaches being conceptualized for Venusian terraforming inform the approaches being developed for terrestrial carbon capture. Story 27. The difference between scientific and technological breakthroughs nobody explains. The popular science communication about breakthroughs conflates two different kinds of achievement that have very different implications for how people's lives actually change. A scientific breakthrough is the discovery of a fact about how the world works, the confirmation of gravitational waves, the identification of a new particle, the determination of a protein structure. A technological breakthrough is the development of a device, process, or method that allows scientific knowledge to be applied in a way that changes what people can do. These two categories are related but not identical, and the gap between them can be decades long. The scientific basis of nuclear power, fission, the mass-energy relationship, the neutron cross-sections of fissile materials, was established in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The technological breakthrough of a commercially operating nuclear power plant occurred in 1957. The scientific basis for mRNA vaccines was established across several decades of molecular biology research culminating in the 1970s and 1980s. The technological breakthrough of an mRNA vaccine administered at clinical scale occurred in 2020. The science-to-technology gap for antibiotics was approximately 12 years. for the internet, roughly 30 years from the theoretical framework to the World Wide Web. The distinction matters for the question of how close we are to specific breakthroughs. Finding water in the atmosphere of an exoplanet is a scientific breakthrough. It tells us something significant about the universe. It does not immediately change anything about daily life. Developing a room temperature superconductor is a scientific breakthrough that would have immediate technological implications because the applications of superconductivity are already understood, and the only barrier is the material. When evaluating claims about how close a breakthrough is, the first question to ask is which kind of breakthrough is being discussed and whether the path from the scientific discovery to the technological application is short or long. Story 28. Head transplant. The surgery that is technically closer than you want it to be the head transplant, or more precisely, the whole body transplant, since from the perspective of the person undergoing it, the head is the part being preserved, has been discussed in the surgical literature since Robert White performed the operation on monkeys in the 1970s. White's monkey survived the surgery and lived for 9 days before dying of immune rejection. The monkey could not move below the neck because spinal cord reconnection, the fundamental neurological challenge that makes the procedure practically useless even if surgical survival is achieved, was not possible with the techniques available. The spinal cord reconnection problem is the core of the challenge and the focus of the research that has moved the field forward. The spinal cord contains millions of axons, the long projections of neurons that carry signals between the brain and the body, and damage to the cord severs these connections in ways that current medicine cannot repair. The regeneration of spinal cord axons across a complete transection has been demonstrated in animal models using polyethylene glycol, a chemical that fuses severed axons, in combination with electrical stimulation and nerve growth factors. Whether this translates to a surgically transected spinal cord in a head transplant context is unknown. The Italian neurosurgeon Sergio Canavero announced in 2017 his intention to perform the first human head transplant, working with Chinese surgeon Xiaoping Ren. The procedure was reportedly performed on a cadaver, and the claims about spinal cord reconnection were not independently verified or published in peer-reviewed form. The ethics of the procedure, who would consent to it, and under what circumstances, what the psychological consequences of living in another person's body would be, how the surgery relates to existing frameworks for organ donation are unresolved. The surgery is closer to being physically performable than most people would prefer it to be. Story 29. Extreme gene modification. CRISPR and the spectrum from treatment to transformation. CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing works by using a guide RNA to direct a molecular cutting enzyme to a specific sequence in the genome, where it makes a precise double-strand break. The cell's repair machinery then either disables the cut gene or, if a template is provided, replaces the cut sequence with a new one. The technology is not magic. It operates within the constraints of what cells can be directed to do. But its precision and accessibility have made it the most powerful tool in the history of genetic engineering. The current applications are primarily therapeutic, correcting single gene disorders like sickle cell disease, developing cancer treatments that modify immune cells to target tumors, eliminating viral sequences integrated into human DNA. These applications work within the existing genome, correcting specific errors while leaving the overall genetic architecture intact. The first CRISPR-based therapy for sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia received FDA approval in December 2023. It is a functional cure. The spectrum of what becomes possible as the technology matures extends far beyond correction of single gene disorders. Multi-gene modifications affecting complex traits, height, intelligence, disease resistance, metabolic efficiency are theoretically achievable, but practically much more difficult because most complex traits are influenced by thousands of variants whose individual effects are small and whose interactions are poorly understood. The research required to understand these interactions before attempting to engineer them is substantial. The theoretical extreme: modifications sufficient to produce characteristics outside the current human range, or to make a human organism fundamentally different from its biological origin, is where science intersects with science fiction in ways that the current technology cannot reach, but that the trajectory suggests will eventually be approached. The question is not whether the technology will eventually be capable of extreme modification, but whether the regulatory frameworks and ethical consensus required to govern its use will be in place before the capability arrives. Story 30. Solid-state batteries and Carey's cures. The utopia that is being held at the gate solid-state batteries replace the liquid electrolyte of conventional lithium-ion batteries with a solid material, ceramic, polymer, or glass that offers higher energy density, faster charging, longer cycle life, and the elimination of the flammability hazard associated with liquid electrolyte batteries. The energy density improvement alone, solid-state batteries can theoretically store 2 to 4 times more energy per unit weight than current lithium-ion cells, would transform electric vehicles, making them lighter and extending their range to the point where charging anxiety disappears as a barrier to adoption. Toyota, Samsung, QuantumScape, and Solid Power are among the organizations with solid-state battery programs targeting commercial production in the mid-2020s. The cure for dental caries, tooth decay, involves a different kind of simple solution to a problem the industry has preferred to manage. Dental caries is caused by specific bacterial species, primarily Streptococcus mutans, that metabolize sugar and produce acid that dissolves tooth enamel. A vaccine that prevents S. mutans colonization of the mouth would make dental caries preventable. Research into such a vaccine has proceeded intermittently for decades and has produced candidates that show efficacy in animal models. The commercial incentives for the dental industry, which depends substantially on the ongoing prevalence of decay requiring filling, crowning, and extraction, run counter to the development of a preventive vaccine. The pattern these two technologies share is the pattern of many potentially transformative technologies. The science works, the prototype works, and the barrier to deployment is not technical but economic. The jobs and revenues associated with managing a problem, battery fires, dental decay, represent interests that resist the adoption of a solution. Whether these interests constitute a conspiracy or simply the ordinary operation of market dynamics that favor existing business models is a distinction that changes the analysis less than it might appear. Story 31. Gene Therapy's Coming Decade. Cancer, muscular dystrophy, and the things that come after gene therapy, the delivery of therapeutic genetic material into a patient's cells to treat or cure disease, spent its first 2 decades as a field defined by its failures. Jesse Gelsinger died in 1999 in a gene therapy trial at the University of Pennsylvania, triggering a regulatory shutdown that lasted years. The technical challenges of delivering genetic material safely and effectively into target cells without triggering the immune responses that killed Gelsinger took another decade to resolve through the development of improved viral vectors and non-viral delivery systems. The FDA has now approved more than 20 gene therapies. Zolgensma, a single-dose gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, is the most expensive med ever approved, but effectively cures a disease that was previously fatal in early childhood. Luxturna treats a form of inherited blindness. The sickle cell and beta thalassemia therapies represent functional cures for the most common severe genetic blood disorders. The trajectory from these early approvals to broader application is now a matter of technical refinement and cost reduction rather than fundamental feasibility. Cancer applications are advancing rapidly. CAR T-cell therapy, in which a patient's immune cells are extracted, genetically modified to recognize specific cancer antigens, and reinfused, has produced remissions in blood cancers that were previously untreatable. The extension of this approach to solid tumors is the current research frontier. Muscular dystrophy, particularly Duchenne, the most severe form, is in late-stage trials for a microdystrophin gene therapy that delivers a shortened but functional version of the missing protein. The things that come after are where the field becomes ethically complex. Designer children selecting and potentially engineering genetic characteristics in embryos is technically achievable now and is being governed by regulatory frameworks whose adequacy is untested by serious commercial pressure. Enhancement applications, making healthy people stronger, smarter, or longer lived through genetic modification, are further away but moving closer faster than the ethical frameworks are moving. Story 32. Self-replicating robots. Exponential growth is closer than you think. The technological components of a self-replicating robotic system are not individually novel. 3D printers that can print many of their own structural parts exist. The RepRap project, which has produced open-source 3D printers capable of printing a significant fraction of their own components since 2008, demonstrated this almost 20 years ago. Robotic arms capable of assembly operations are standard industrial equipment. Computer chips capable of running the control logic for a basic robotic system are cheap, abundant, and shrinking in cost. The assembly of these components into a genuinely self-replicating system is an integration problem, not a fundamental physics problem. The minimalist requirements for a self-replicating robotic system are actually quite modest. The system needs to be able to print or otherwise fabricate its own structural components from available feedstock, assemble those components into a functional replica, and reproduce its own control logic. It does not need general intelligence. It does not need to be able to handle arbitrary situations. It needs to be able to do one thing well: produce another version of itself from raw materials. The exponential growth implications are the reason this capability is simultaneously so consequential and so carefully not being pursued in the obvious way. A single self-replicating robot that doubles every 24 hours produces 2 after day 1, 4 after day 2, and approximately 1 trillion after 40 days. The resource consumption of the doubling process is the limiting factor. If the feedstock is abundant and the energy source is available, exponential growth of robotic systems proceeds until a physical constraint is reached. Whether self-replicating robots would be directed toward useful ends, building infrastructure, manufacturing goods, exploring and developing space, or would constitute an uncontrolled gray goo scenario depends entirely on the control systems and the intentions of the originators. The technology is not behind ethics. The ethics are behind the technology. Story 33. Biological immortality. The first person who will not die of age has already been born. Aubrey de Grey, the biomedical gerontologist who founded the SENS Research Foundation, has been making this claim for more than 2 decades. The first human being who will not die of age-related causes has already been born, and the person who will live to 1,000 years old has probably already been born as well. The claim is not based on a specific breakthrough being imminent, but on the compound logic of incremental anti-aging progress and the time value of life extension. If treatments available today can extend a person's healthy lifespan by 20 years, and if 20 years of research produces treatments that extend it by another 20 years, and if this process continues indefinitely, the person alive today who starts the process could in principle ride successive waves of life, extending therapy forward indefinitely. The biological basis for this optimism is the hallmarks of an aging framework. Aging is not a single process, but approximately 9 distinct biological mechanisms: cellular senescence, telomere attrition, mitochondrial dysfunction, epigenetic drift, and others, each of which is potentially addressable with specific interventions. Senolytics clear senescent cells. Telomerase activators address telomere shortening. NAD+ precursors and mitochondria-targeted interventions address mitochondrial decline. None of these individually produces dramatic life extension. The question is what their combination, applied systematically and continuously, might achieve. The longevity biotech sector has attracted billions of dollars of investment. Companies targeting specific hallmarks of aging are in clinical trials. The rate of progress in the field over the past decade measured in the number of papers published, trials initiated, and biological targets identified, is genuinely accelerating. Whether the first person to live forever is alive now depends on assumptions about the rate of future progress that cannot be verified in advance. What can be said is that the people working on the problem believe the timeline is shorter than the general public assumes, and that the biology they are working with supports more optimism than the cultural conversation about mortality currently permits. Story 34, Bioengineering the Biosphere. The centuries-long climate fix nobody is discussing the dominant conversation about climate change, operates on a timescale of decades, and focuses on emissions reduction. Limiting the addition of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere through changes in energy systems, transportation, and industrial processes. This is necessary. It is also insufficient on its own to address the climate trajectory that the accumulated emissions of the industrial era have already set in motion. The temperature commitments embedded in the existing atmospheric CO2 concentration will continue to drive warming even if all emissions ceased tomorrow. The longer-term perspective, planning across centuries rather than decades, opens a different set of interventions. The Earth's climate system has been regulated throughout geological history by biological processes, primarily the carbon cycle, in which photosynthetic organisms remove CO2 from the atmosphere and ocean systems sequester organic carbon in deep sediments. The human modification of this system, through deforestation, industrial agriculture, and the combustion of fossil carbon accumulated over millions of years, has disrupted biological regulation in ways that no short-term technological fix can reverse. Bioengineering the biosphere means deliberately managing the biological components of the carbon cycle at planetary scale, not simply preserving existing forests, but actively engineering the composition, distribution, and productivity of forest and ocean ecosystems to maximize carbon sequestration and regulate the water cycle in ways that stabilize surface temperatures. This includes managed reforestation with species selected for carbon sequestration capacity, manipulation of ocean phytoplankton communities to enhance the biological pump that transfers carbon to deep water, and the potential introduction of engineered organisms specifically designed for carbon capture. The timescale is centuries, not decades. No political system currently operates plans at this timescale. No institution has the mandate or the continuity to implement a centuries-long program. This is simultaneously the most practical long-term solution to climate change and the most institutionally impossible to organize. The discussion needs to begin before the window for meaningful intervention closes. Story 35. Room temperature superconductivity, the breakthrough that keeps almost happening. Superconductivity was discovered in 1911 when Heike Kamerlingh cooled mercury to near absolute zero and found that its electrical resistance dropped to exactly zero. The phenomenon is not fully explained by classical physics. It requires quantum mechanics to account for the paired electron states that carry current without scattering. For the first several decades after its discovery, superconductivity was observed only in metals cooled to within a few degrees of absolute zero, temperatures achievable only with liquid helium and practically useful only in specialized applications. The discovery of high-temperature superconductivity in ceramic copper oxide compounds in 1986, which won its discoverers the Nobel Prize in Physics the following year, shattered the theoretical upper limit on superconducting transition temperatures that had been accepted since the 1970s, and opened a research program that has been producing surprises ever since. The new materials worked at temperatures achievable with liquid nitrogen rather than liquid helium, still very cold by everyday standards, but dramatically more practical for applications. The subsequent decades have produced a series of advances in which novel materials demonstrate superconducting properties at progressively higher temperatures, interspersed with controversies over claims that proved unreproducible. The 2023 LK99 episode, a Korean research team published claims of room temperature superconductivity in a lead copper apatite compound that attracted enormous public attention before failing rapid replication attempts worldwide, exemplifies both the excitement and the caution that characterize the field. What advances seem to come in clusters. Theoretical frameworks for predicting which material classes are likely to superconduct at high temperatures have improved substantially. Machine learning models trained on existing superconductor databases are being used to predict new candidate materials. The field has been in a relative dry period since the hydrogen sulfide and lanthanum hydride results of 2015 and 2019. The next cluster of advances may be close. Room temperature superconductivity at atmospheric pressure remains the field's defining goal, and it is closer to being achievable than it has ever been.